crime. Let's get into this discussion now, taking you back to one of our leading stories. President Cyril Ramaphosa has downplayed the non-attendance of senior United States officials at the G20 meeting of foreign ministers in Johannesburg. He says the country continues to work to normalize relations with the United States. Let's speak now to the South African Institute of International Affairs Chief Executive, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. Elizabeth, good evening to you and thank you very much for your time. President Ramaphosa's words, I want to extrapolate from some of what he said, and it is that it's their choice not to come, but South Africa will power ahead, although his language still steeped in diplomatic language. But what do you make of those utterances?
Well, of course, the US was present at the foreign ministers meeting today via the chargé d'affaires at the US embassy here in Pretoria. So it's not that the US has completely boycotted the G20 processes. What is unfortunate, of course, is that the US is a member of the Troika. In other words, the US will be taking over from South Africa at the end of our presidency in November. They will assume the rotating presidency of the G20. And usually what that means is that there is a Troika arrangement that coordinates every year from year to year. So we were part of the Troika arrangement with Brazil and India last year. And this year, the Troika arrangement is Brazil, South Africa, and the US. The fact that at a foreign ministers meetings, you don't have the foreign minister, the Secretary of State, or indeed a senior official from the State Department. It's not a train smash. I think the president used those words at some point, but it does sort of make it a little bit more difficult to coordinate as a troika. At the end of the day, the G20 is about building consensus, and the troika plays an important role in coordinating and building building that consensus.
Yeah. The president also does seem to use the language that it is their choice. I don't know whether you think I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here. It is their choice not to come, but we are not going to, I'm using my own language now, we're not going to fret over this. If anything, they're going to find us on the way. Does that sound like frustration to you? Or South Africa really has to just continue with the work at hand? If the United States decides to participate, it is their choice.
No, I mean, absolutely. There was one occasion during the first Trump presidency in 2017, during the G20 summit, which was chaired in that year by Germany, where, the president was in fact participating in the discussion, and in the final summit communique, they couldn't get the US to agree to the language around climate. And the way in which they went around that, because everybody else in the G20 actually agreed to it, was they said, well, this is what the G19 agree, and they included at the bottom a clause that said, well, the US doesn't agree with us. I can't remember now the wording. The fact of the matter is the G20 is bigger than a sort of one individual member, albeit this is an important, of course, member state. It is a very important. It's the dominant economic financial power, but it is a member of a collective, of a group that's supposed to coordinate and work together. And so I think it would not be the right thing to say, well, if the US is not at the table, we cannot continue with the G20. We must continue with the G20. There are important issues on the agenda that are critical for development, for finance, for climate, for health, etc., etc. The rest of the G20, or at least most of the rest of the G20, I think are on the same page, certainly about using the G20 as a forum to build consensus on issues that you can then take into other formal multilateral bodies like the UN, like the WTO, like the WHO. And I think that's an important message that the president did send, and I think it was the correct one.
Yeah. I wonder, Elizabeth, whether the United States stance here around the G20, South Africa's presidency of the G20, is in a way going to almost be a test of whether or not the world can actually move along without the United States? And might it be a blessing in disguise, or am I really being naive here? And I ask you this because there are issues on the table, such as what the president pointed to, issues of climate change. South Africa going through very much of that at the moment. We know what stance President Trump has on climate. The Paris Agreement, it's something that I think he has already dismissed. So, with their non-presence, would that almost be a test, first of all, as to whether United States really still is a powerhouse? But second of all, might it be good for parties that are participating in order to come to agreements, perhaps quickly?
I think the important point here is that we have so many crises that we have to deal with as a planet that we can't afford not to come together, even if it's an incomplete coming together, and actually try to grapple with these really some of these are existential challenges. Now, the fact of the matter is that absolutely the US is a very important player in the world, whether one talks about climate and emissions, whether one talks about the fact that it has a veto, in effect a veto, for example, in the International Monetary Fund and in the World Bank, that it actually has the dollar, which it can use to sanction and to weaponize, that it is an important economy with which many countries have a significant both import and export relationship. All of these mean that you can't ignore the US, but at the same time, you can't say that because the US is not in the arena with us, that we can't actually, that the coalition of the willing, let's call it that, where which is defined by a recognition of our mutual interests, that we can't actually chart a way forward. It may not be the best way forward, because it would be important for say on climate, for a big country, a big emitter like the US to be part of it. But we must do what we must and what we can. And I think that has to be the priority that all countries in both informal groupings such as the G20, but also in the more formal settings where there might be disruption from the US, given this administration's aversion to multilateralism, I think they have to adopt that stance. So it may end up being an imperfect outcome, but there will be some outcome, rather than us throwing our hands in the air and saying, well, if the US doesn't play ball, we can't play the match.
Yeah. Can I then sway the discussion to South Africa's bilateral relations between the US and itself? And I'm asking this because there is reporting today suggesting that AfriForum is going to be visiting the United States to do what they say is a mission to salvage the AGOA agreement. I'm bringing this into the equation to ask you this question, whether over the next 4 years, or should we say for the duration of the Trump administration, might we see a relationship that simply is not salvageable, at least for the next 4 years? Or is this actually going to dissipate and we might see AfriForum really being sidelined or sidestepped at some point?
The first point that we must always remember is that South Africa is not the only one that over the last 4 weeks has been experiencing a difficult relationship with the US. Some of the US's ostensible staunchest allies have had to deal with spates of executive orders. So, I mean, I think that's important to bear in mind. That the relationship will be a smooth one, I think, is probably not, that would be extremely naive to think about, to consider. Is there a possibility that it can improve? I do believe it. I think I think from a South African perspective, and indeed other countries are also sort of looking at how they develop a strategy to engage with this administration. It's important to not unnecessarily provoke or escalate issues. But it is important that we have a strategy about what we do, how we engage in order to mend the relationship now, but also how we respond if we find certain significant obstacles along the way. I do think the visits to the US are going to be critical, also for not AfriForum, but I'm talking here about the president's envoys. It is going to be a tricky relationship, and it's not just because of South Africa. I think we're seeing it with the way in which the US is engaging with Mexico, with Canada, with the European Union, which are all allies, and then of course with countries like China, issues of trade and tariffs. You know, what does the President Trump call them? Beautiful tariffs and so on. I think we've been in the crosshairs around on AGOA even before the Trump administration. So that is going to be a very difficult process to ensure that we secure continued access. I don't know if to be honest, I don't know if we're going to manage that, and that is an issue that is not just, as I say, a characteristic of this administration. It's been a problem for some years, and I think we also have to factor in that there are strong lobbies within the US about some positions that South Africa has taken geopolitically, and of course the most obvious of those is the position around Israel, which, you know, South Africa is not going to back down from. And what it has done is in fact used the institutions of global governance, used the International Court of Justice for it to pass judgment on the case, which is, I think, the correct way to go if you believe that there has been a violation of the Genocide Convention.
Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, thank you very much for your time and insights. Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs.